All right, guys, Murph's here. And today I want to do a little comparison for you. Now, this was actually a video requested by a viewer, and this is talking about semi-automatics versus revolvers for duty use with a little bit of a caveat thrown towards concealed carry. Now, there are a couple of caveats we have to go ahead and get through right off the bat. So, guys, this is going to be a very long video. There's going to be a lot of subjects that we're going to skirt the very edge of, and I'm going to try not to fall into. However, rabbit holes do occur. So, with that being the case, if you're in a hurry or if I'm dragging on for too long during a particular subject, go ahead and check the description in order to be able to jump to content that you actually want to consume and learn more about. Maybe at some point come back and finish the rest of the video. That's up to you. I don't want to take any more of your time than what you're willing to give me. Now, in addition to that, we are going to primarily discuss duty use, a couple of caveats thrown towards concealed carry. What's very important to understand about these two different aspects are your realms of expectation. It's kind of the term I made up in the time that I've been sitting here. So, whenever I am conducting concealed carry, I have an expectation for armed conflict that is very low. I'm still aware of my surroundings. I'm still evaluating for potential threats and all that kind of stuff. I'm still carrying a gun. However, I'm not moving towards danger. I'm trying to avoid danger. My expectation is to avoid a fight as much as I can, and then if I somehow get drug into one, I win. I come out fighting and I do what it is that I need to do. That is very different in concept to a duty type use, be it police, military, contractor, whatever it may be, in which the expectation is that you are going to move towards danger. So with that, there's a higher expectation that you could be involved in an extended gunfight, that you could have to face multiple assailants or something along those lines. Not to say that multiple assailants couldn't happen in a self-defense type situation, but in our overall threat assessment and all that kind of stuff, I am way higher expectation for armed conflict in a duty type sense than I am a self-defense type scenario. So that is what should drive our expectations. I want to be able to not just win a fight, but establish fire superiority. I need to be able to make sure that I can take on multiple assailants, be able to conduct fast, be able to have a wide assortment or a large amount of ammunition on me and all those types of things like that. The fight that I expect to get into is very different than the fight I expect to get into in a self-defense type situation as you're just off-duty or average civilian. All right, and the final thing being, I do have some shooting footage put together for you guys here today. And the handguns that I picked are kind of specific. So for revolvers, I selected this Ruger Security 6 chambered in .357 Magnum, able to chamber .38 Special, and with a 4-inch barrel as our duty revolver. For our duty handgun, I selected this Browning Hipower chambered in 9mm. Now, I found these two options very interesting because during the transitional period between double action revolvers and semi-automatic handguns and law enforcement and different types of like SWAT units and stuff like that, or even special forces units around the world, these two handguns absolutely would have gone head to head multiple times. We're talking FBI HRT, Israeli Mossad, even CAG, honestly. A lot of different units would have evaluated these two handguns at the same time, or they would have been occupying holsters in those units at the same time. So I find these an interesting overall comparison. All right, guys, that pretty much covers it for our caveats and all that kind of stuff. So let's go ahead and start talking about history. Now, revolvers have had a long history in armed conflict. Be it military use or law enforcement type use, revolvers have been present multiple times over. Double action revolvers even extend all the way back to the Civil War. At the later stages, the late 1800s and the early 1900s is when semi-automatics really started to become the new trend. And there were a lot of people who saw a lot of advantage in being able to move over to semi-autos. However, there's an issue when we're talking about new technology is being able to make it reliable, being able to make it inexpensive to manufacture and powerful in handgun terms. Now, keep in mind, guys, when we're talking about handguns, we're not talking about great fight stoppers. We're talking about convenient fight stoppers because they're easier to carry, but a rifle or a shotgun, any type of long gun, is a much better actual fight stopper than a handgun ever is. However, handguns, being more portable, are something that we're more likely to have available to us should a fight arise. Should we not be looking for a fight, but it come to find us. Now, semi-autos would immediately start seeing some adoption in military circles shortly after their inception, but it would take some years before they would truly become reliable. Now, the reliability type aspect, we can talk about that till we're blue in the face. Most people will tell you that revolvers will never fail. I can tell you right now, I've seen plenty of revolvers fail for a wide variety of reasons. Ammunition failures, or even some type of mechanical failures. Not fully allowing the trigger out before you start your next engagement where you're shooting the handgun. Or not necessarily making sure that the cylinder is properly locked up after a reload before you go into your next engagement. Things like those can cause these guns to fail at the most inopportune times. It is not as frequent as semi-autos. Now, with that being the case, with there being an inherent expectation that revolvers are more reliable than semi-autos, revolvers would stick around for duty use for many years to come. Now, for the most part, especially in the United States military, they would be done away with fairly early on, with some caveats. The Colt M1917 and the Smith & Wesson 1917 45 ACP caliber revolvers would be utilized in service in order to be able to supplement the lack of production of 1911. So there would be 38 specials issued out in the military as well. The British would continue to use the Webley for well into the 60s, and all sorts. The French would continue to use all kinds of different, all these different militaries are still using revolvers. They still have a purpose. However, they quickly get supplanted by semi-automatic handguns. It's the end state here. That's where it is that we're going. But for police type use, at least in the United States, the revolver would stick around for quite a while. Now, as semi-automatic handgun technology advanced, revolvers started to see themselves being replaced. And eventually, by the 1980s, even the FBI had adopted 9mm semi-automatic handguns, and were also still allowing the use of double-action revolvers. This is where we're getting in this transitional period, where units or departments, whatever, are using these guns at the same time. Now, the Miami-Dade County shootout, which was a shootout involving the FBI, would kind of change a lot of opinions on things as far as the viability of not just the revolver, but also the 9mm semi-automatic cartridge. This would cause the adoption of the 10mm and eventually would cause the adoption of the 40 Smith & Wesson after it was found that 10mm can be a tad much for everybody to handle. Now, one of the things moving along with this is at this time, 357 Magnum revolvers are incredibly common. And that's a lot of energy and stuff like that. 357 Magnum is a fantastic defensive cartridge if paired with the proper revolver. However, it's rounds limited, and when the 40 Smith when the 10mm and then the 40 Smith & Wesson come online, to where you have a little bit more of a potent cartridge available with more capacity, that starts to kind of move the 357 Magnum onto its back foot at that point. Now, an important thing to keep in mind as well is where we're at with metallurgy, and whenever it comes to bullet design and all those types of things, to where, especially going from the 1940s into the 1980s, across this timeline right here, there are not a lot of effective hollow points out of the market. In order to be able to have an effective hollow point, you need either a very special combination of metallurgy on the inside of the bullet, or you need a pretty wide opening. Well, the issue with wide openings and hollow points is that they will mess up the feeding. It'll hit the feed ramp funny on a semi-auto or something along those lines and cause a malfunction. Now we're back to a functional issue. So it's not that uncommon at this time to see FMJ ammunition still used in semi-automatics because of reliability. Whereas revolvers don't have that issue. All you have to do is make sure that cylinder is aligned with the barrel, and then it's going to do what it is that you need to do. So from there, you're able to develop hollow points, soft point, semi-lead, hollow points, all those types of things. You can get plenty of different expanding type bullets into the mix in a cylinder, which you cannot necessarily do in a semi-auto. One of the great things about a semi-auto, though, at this time, if you can't get expansion to work for you, having a wider projectile becomes equally advantageous. That way, if your hollow point fails, you're at least still making a larger hole than, say, perhaps a 9mm. And there's a dynamic to be struck there. It's not necessarily the best answer, but eventually, as we move into the 2000s, metallurgy would catch up and we would start getting dependable expanding bullets. Now, of course, as a result of Miami-Dade, the FBI started doing a lot of research and assisting the development on these hollow points, and they would establish their expectations for good expansion and penetration characteristics of fight-stopping bullets. So the 12 to 18 inches penetration distance, as well as 1.5 time expansion. And now, in the current state, we have plenty of semi-automatic pistol cartridges that will achieve those dynamics through 4 layers of denim and all that type of stuff. This was not so previously. This was what kept the revolver a viable option. However, now that we are into the 21st century, the revolvers, for the most part, have almost been completely eclipsed by semi-automatic platforms. So now the question becomes, is that fair? So let's go ahead and talk about a little bit of comparisons, because there's some things that we have to talk about in the dynamic of engaging targets with revolvers versus semi-autos. So first off, there's keeping the gun on target. Now, a couple things I want to talk about in this overall dynamic here, guys. It's been a while. Another reason I picked these two guns, I know I'm kind of bouncing around a little bit here, but another reason I picked these two guns is I haven't trained with either of these in a while. So I thought it would be a really good apples to apples comparison as far as some of the intricacies of running these two guns by coming in pretty cold to the overall setup. Plus, I plan on running this high power and some IDPA matches coming up. So I thought it would be fun to kind of break back in, and then also, since I haven't trained with this revolver in a while, it would be very interesting to see how it is that I worked back into it as well. So a couple things that you're going to notice in some of the footage that's coming up. I'm having a little bit of issue with the clasp on this particular holster. It's probably time for a new holster, honestly. This thing's pretty old. As well as, this does not have drop-free magazines. So something I have to remember whenever I'm done shooting is to, see, and I missed it there, is to strip the magazine on the way out. So come back, gun's empty, strip, and then secure my new magazine. I think that one's just slick. That's a new magazine. I'm still playing around with that one. So that's something you're going to see in these dynamics coming up. All right, so first off, just engaging with these handguns. So because we're talking about duty type use, we are of course engaging with this handgun in double action, because that is how you should be fighting with double action revolvers. There's a reason no one's carrying single action revolvers past the late 1800s as defensive type uses, and that is because whenever you cock this hammer, you now have a substantially lighter trigger pull, and that is not helpful if you're in a very fluid and dynamic situation. That's actually potentially very dangerous for yourself and others. So the issue becomes, if you're, say, maneuvering around a building or something like that, and you come up on a threat that you're not entirely sure if they're a problem or not. If this finger comes back and starts to prep that trigger before you fully understand what all's going on around you, there's a high probability that you can engage that target who might wind up being a no-shoot before you're actually ready. That's why double action triggers are preferred in these types of situations. Now, in addition to that, let's say you're moving through that building and stuff like that, and somebody manages to close the distance with you very rapidly. They pop out of a closet or something, I don't know. Now you're potentially in a struggle for your firearm with the trigger in a very sensitive state. This is either going to end very poorly for you or for the other guy. And the chances are pretty 50-50 on this as you're trying to fight for this gun. So that's not necessarily a good condition to default to. Now, a lot of times people will say, well, I like to cock it back for those really long shots. Well, if you're taking really long shots with a handgun, I would kind of suggest that you do something else at that point. Just overall, I'm not saying that it can't be done. I'm just saying that's also very difficult, and that's really low probability shooting at that point. Maybe you should find another option that doesn't potentially result in somebody else getting shot who you don't intend to shoot. All right, now, kind of like a know your backdrop thing. Now, the issue for a lot of people with double action triggers, though, is that they are very long. And they do take some training to be able to master. Now, honestly, it's not that difficult once you get into the rhythm and all that kind of stuff, and you understand how to be able to work the trigger, work back towards that wall and all those types of things. And then also the release is a very important aspect of shooting double action revolvers. But you have to understand those types of things. And if you're not on top of them, there's a good possibility that that front sight's going to start to move around on you as you're trying to engage that target, and you could potentially run into the situation of turning a justified shoot into a homicide investigation. You have to be very careful about that overall. However, when we're talking about semi-autos, we have the option to be able to have single action triggers. This is a single action trigger with the capability to be carried, cocked, and locked. So with this, I get a consistent trigger pull every time I pull the trigger. Same with, say, a striker fire trigger. Now, of course, there are double action, single action triggers and double action only triggers out there for semi-autos as well. And that's a trainingism, a thing that you have to get down. But you'll still have a consistent engagement no matter what it is that you do that could potentially be easier to engage with than your average double action revolver trigger. That's just something to keep in mind overall. Now, let's go ahead, take a little look at some footage real quick, comparing these two being fired. I'll annotate times in there so that you guys can have a reference point for, additional data and all that kind of stuff.
Set up or from the one you got from
they're big blocky sights too, so it's not to be, accurate at. There's two more? Yeah, one's great. Yeah, we got that.
All right, so that's shooting them. Now, something else, let's talk about potency of cartridge. Now, I'm shooting this during this filming, and if I get the opportunity to mix in some 357 Magnum footage as well, I'll annotate that, but I'm shooting this with 38 Special, and actually some target loads at that. This handgun is incredibly easy to keep on target with 38 Special. It's not terrible in 357 Magnum, but it's also a little bit lighter of a frame than some of your 357 Magnums that are out there. Now, of course, whenever we're talking about carrying these things all day and all that kind of stuff, weight is a factor. And having a good duty belt to be able to sustain that weight is an important aspect of that. However, whenever you start talking about revolvers, yes, you can absolutely cram more powerful cartridges in them, and you can get, smaller, lighter setups and all that kind of stuff. The question becomes can you control them in a rapid shot string? And the tempting thing for some people to do is to interject some macho stuff into this conversation. Like, well, I carry a 44 Magnum so that I only have to shoot once because shooting twice is stupid. Okay, well, neat sentiment. However, the reality of actual armed conflict, if you look at any of the most recent police-involved shootings, is that you're going to fire more than one round. And you're going to fire them rapidly. You're going to dump magazines. You're going to empty cylinders, because that used to be a thing as well when revolvers were common. And the question becomes is, at that weight of pistol or revolver and that chambering, can you hold it on target to be able to effectively continue to place hits on your opposing target when your adrenaline drops? That's the biggest thing. Once that adrenaline dump comes in and you just start working that trigger as fast as you can, are you actually going to be able to stack good hits? And that's a key part of actual defensive type shootings anyway, is it's not just a matter of, well, I know I'm carrying a potent cartridge, I just need to bang one time. No, you need to keep shooting until they are no longer offering resistance, until they are incapable or unwilling to fight back. And that doesn't just mean that they're on the ground either, because someone can still fight you from the ground as well. Especially if you're drawing and coming up on the target and firing and all that kind of stuff, you may not necessarily get a really great center mass hit the first time. Not if you're trying to move fast and be able to get hits on that target before they get hits on you. So maybe you blast them in the shoulder. They're still capable of fighting you and you already shot them once, because this is where the shot placement guys come in at. The reality of armed conflict is it's not two dudes standing out in the middle of the street facing each other at dusk ready to shoot each other. They're moving, you're moving, everyone's moving. No one wants to get shot. Nobody wants to get tagged in this game. So it's not outside of the realm of possibility that your shot that you thought was going to be center mass actually winds up taking them in the hip or something like that. It can absolutely happen. You should be shooting more than once. Now, the temptation, of course, at that point is to then switch over to 38 Special or something like that because it's a lighter recoiling cartridge. However, if you look at a lot of standard pressure 38 Special data out there, velocity, mass, and its relationship with energy, it's pretty anemic. It's not very impressive. And the wound channels, I mean, a lot of that comes back to load and all that kind of stuff, but you're talking about 45 ACP velocity with easily 80 grains less mass. It's not a good energy relationship there. You'll actually find quite a few 9mm loadings that defeat that. However, you get into the plus Ps and the plus P pluses, you get into better overall fight stopping characteristics and all that kind of stuff. Honestly, 357 Magnum would have probably been my go-to load with an appropriately weighted revolver in order to be able to have excellent fight stopping characteristics, because that's a lot of energy. 357 mag generates a lot of energy out of a 4-inch barrel, as well as being able to maintain control and all that kind of stuff. That's kind of the overall, I guess, end point of that conversation there. Now, of course, with semi-autos, you can go with 9mm, 40, 45, 10mm, whatever it is that you want to do, and you can get a lot of good fight-stopping ballistics, proper penetration, appropriate expansion, all that kind of stuff, and higher capacity. And that's where the next part of the conversation comes in. So this handgun has a 13-round magazine. You can get them with 15-round, or you can get 15-round magazines now. This one holds 6. Now, there are, of course, revolvers, 357 Magnum chamber revolvers out there that hold 8 rounds and would be excellent options. But, you know, especially once Glock came on the scene with the 17, which holds 17 rounds, and you've got all these other, you know, modern polymer striker-fired guns that are fairly light, hold a ton of ammunition, have consistent trigger pulls, you've got a lot of really great options, in addition to the reloading process, at least not necessarily for this gun. So, a lot of people like to bring up, well, you know, you've got speed loaders, so they ought to make that go by real fast. This is an HKS speed loader out of my Bianchi speed loader carrier. You know, you ought to be able to reload that real fast. Well, let's go ahead and take a look at some reload footage. All right, so as you guys can see there's definitely a little bit of a speed advantage to the semi-auto by like a lot. So keep that in mind with what it is that we're talking about. Now, of course, I'm taking a magazine full of ammunition and I'm basically doing packet loading, right? So as long as I'm relatively efficient with getting this magazine out, which this handgun's not necessarily the most sterling example of, and appropriate orientation and placement of my follow-on magazines, I can get this handgun gassed up and back into the fight pretty fast. This, on the other hand, I've got to make sure that the old rounds clear, which sometimes they don't properly. Sometimes you got swelled casings that somehow manage to override the ejector. And then I've got to line up my speed loader, get those rounds properly seated into the cylinder, and then make sure that the cylinder locks appropriately whenever I come off of the reload. Now also, of course, the positioning of it's all the same when it comes to that as far as your relationship to your mechanism of feed, but regardless, you've got to do all those things in order to make sure that you come off of that ready to go. Is it impossible? No. And actually, honestly, guys, I've gotten pretty good splits on it whenever I'm consistently working with revolvers. But when you consider the amount of effort and energy and time and ammunition I had to put into being able to get those really good splits, as opposed to something that has a more efficient manner of being reloaded, you can understand why applying that equal amount of time into this platform gives me a lot more payoff for what it is that I'm trying to do. All right, guys. Now, with this discussion, how do I feel about revolvers in present duty use? I disagree with them. I think for the modern fight, with a lot of the modern innovations that are out there on the market, a semi-automatic handgun is a lot more applicable than a revolver is. It's not to say that a revolver won't work as much as it's to say that it is, to borrow a term from some other people, obsolescent. It's not yet fully obsolete. I would say that a single action only gun is obsolete, but this is on the trend of obsolescent for duty use. There are better options that are more in tune with the actual engagement that's being had, be it in a combat environment or, in the streets of LA, which really, oddly enough, aren't that different. So, little jab at California. So, with that being the case, for myself, I do not figure this into an actual high potential of armed conflict type situation. When I'm evaluating that I actually expect to be able to run towards a fight, a revolver is not what I want to carry. Now, for hunting type use or self-defense type use, that's different because I'm not necessarily seeking out a fight or expecting to put myself between somebody else in a fight, as much as I am planning on using this to defend myself, others in the right situation, but I'm not pursuing the fight. And this should be enough to be able to get me through that. But that's one of the key things whenever you're planning out your gear and stuff like that, guys. If your goal is to pursue the fight, do not set yourself up with minimal gear. That's silly. That's tying a hand behind your back. Don't do that. You need to set yourself up for the worst case scenario, the worst case reasonable scenario, because if you're out there walking around with silver bullets because you're afraid of werewolves, that's maybe, if that is a viable concern for where it is that you're at, you need to go find a new place. But regardless, you need to set yourself up for something that is reasonable, optimized for a reasonable engagement. So that way, when it's not this worst case scenario, reasonable expectation, you're good to go. You have something to fall back on. You aren't necessarily like, well, yeah, I just carry 2 magazines because 2 magazines should be all I need to have. In a duty type sense, it's a little silly because you empty that first magazine and have to go to a second. You don't have a full up spare to be able to replace that partially depleted magazine in order to make sure you're plussed up in case the fight goes on, starts up again after you thought it was done. Those types of things, those types of dynamics. You need to be thinking about the next step. This is not a simple game of checkers. This is definitely chess. Chess involves having a lot more options available and a better understanding of the game that you're playing. All right, guys. I think that's pretty much what I got on this subject. I know I went on for a little while. I hope you guys found this interesting and this information thought-provoking. Go ahead and do some real quick channel updates here for you. Murph's Law is now on Facebook with the Murph's Law official firearms channel. So if you guys enjoy this content or previous stuff that I put up, if you want better access to me to be able to ask questions, or you want a community, a group of like-minded people who might have other experiences or points of view that are similar or counter to my own, go ahead and join the Facebook page. We'd love to have you there, get some input, and get involved in some discussions and all that kind of stuff, and really expand everyone's knowledge overall. All right, guys, that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.